welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. So, what connects young people from London, Taipei, Hong Kong, New York, and many other cities around the world? Well, it's not just the love for avocado toast. I'll explain more of that later. Many of them may work as hard as their parents or grandparents, but they still struggle to buy a home or even rent one at an affordable price. To talk more about the global property crisis, we will be heading to Hong Kong to hear from Alfred Romann. And here in Taipei, we have Alan Chan. I'll start with you though, Alfred. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you're connected to this topic.
My name is Alfred Romann and I'm the CEO of Delta Analysis. We're a data and analytics company. I'm connected to this topic in several ways, but mostly by looking at the data related to this and working with my staff, not only here in Hong Kong, but also in Vancouver and in Argentina, believe it or not, which is where our programmers are. And it's an important topic. It's an important topic that affects everybody, not just the young people that can't afford to buy a home at the prices as they are today, but also older people that may have to help them look after them or have them live in their own homes, their parents' homes, and even the next generation of young people that may not be able to do that either. It's drastically changing the dynamics of home ownership and economies as a whole.
Well, Alan, you are the office director of ours. Can you tell me more about that organization and what it's trying to do?
I'm Alan Chang from Taiwan. I'm very happy to be invited today. And my organization is called OURS, OURS. And this means the Organization of Urban Risk. Revolution, reform, or reimagine, something like that. So my organization focuses on urban and housing issue in Taiwan.
And I want to talk about Taipei in particular, since we're right here. Tell us what the situation here in Taipei looks like.
I think in Taiwan, or even in Taipei, our youth have no affordable choice. According to some statistics, the rent is unaffordable. You have to pay almost half of the salary to rent a illegal rooftop, or what we call a subdivided flat. And if you want to buy a real estate, you have to pay 60 or even 70 of your salary. So I think it's very unaffordable for the youth. So I think it's not good for youth to make a good living in the city. So I think people and even youth don't have any choice at a good housing situation in Taipei.
Now we have some people and we have a roundtable here with exactly those points. We could have started this topic with graphs and numbers, the way it's usually done. But as Alan and Alfred both mentioned, behind those figures, there are always people with real struggles. And in Taipei, housing is often a central issue in their lives. So we invited a group of young professionals to share their experiences with the housing situation here.
Well, housing in Taipei is something that everyone has an opinion about, and it's, I think, from what I understand, everyone talks about and everyone discusses. I have three people with kind of very different situations here. So you've bought a house already, you're renting and don't really want to buy a house, and you also bought a house relatively recently. The housing has got really expensive now, and the ratio from incomes to house prices has only got higher and higher over the last 10 years or so. So were there any particular financial sacrifices or priorities you had to make in order to be able to buy your house earlier on in life?
In the past, I always wanted to have an opportunity to live or to work, overseas for a while. So I had that plan to study abroad for a master or something, but to do a degree overseas is expensive. So I was choosing between having a degree overseas or having an apartment to myself in Taiwan.
Renting is a reasonable choice when you don't have, you're young and you don't have enough money, or if your parents don't have enough money for you, spare money for you. Then you can rent, and then you don't have to maintain the house.
In terms of renting across the board, because I have experience renting in Taipei as well, and it's my sense of it is that it's highly competitive, and places go like that.
Yes.
Any horror stories?
I have a lot of stories. I bet you too, because you used to move like every year, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the only way to get a really good house is you dedicate a time on Wuzhouyi for like weeks, and then you do it every day and every few hours to see the newest updated like the housing, and that you contact the landlord right away, because the real good housing without any problems will be rented out within 2 to 3 days, sometimes one. I got one of my houses, one of my like my best house, a great deal, in 1 hour. He updated it. I called him right away. It was like 5 minutes ago, and he was like, "You sure you want to come over now?" I was like, "Yes." It was at 7 p.m. and I was like, "Yes."
You knew.
Yeah. I was like, "I want to go there right away." I was like, "Okay, I'll meet you in 30 minutes." We went to a 7-Eleven nearby, like 1 minute walk, and we bought the contract, and then I took all the deposit from the ATM.
So you went with the landlord to the 7-Eleven.
Yes.
You gave him the cash on the spot.
Yeah.
And I remember you were mentioning there was some kind of difficulties in terms of accessing property as a foreigner who's in Taiwan and encountered some kind of discrimination in the property buying process or renting process. Could you talk a little bit about that experience?
I'm from Indonesia, and then they will ask about what do I do? Okay, what's your job? And then where's your parents? Where's your family? Why you only can stay just by yourself? So they need some, I don't know how to say that in Taiwan, but maybe they cannot feel very, very secure when they want to rent their house to somebody that coming abroad from outside and then stay in Taiwan alone. Yeah.
Well, for the full discussion, you can always go to our TaiwanPlus YouTube channel, where Yunnan, Tony, and Mengzhou explain how they navigated the property market here. Well, let's go back to our guest. And Alfred, let me start with you. Was there anything there that resonated with you with the situation these young people are facing in Taipei? Is it something that we've seen in cities like Hong Kong, Vancouver, other places where you've kind of had an understanding of what the property market is like?
Yes. I think one of the panelists mentioned that good apartments are gone in 2 to 3 days, and it's a frenzy to get them and get them fast, and they're expensive. And you see something similar in Hong Kong, absolutely. Vancouver, where I actually live, you see it as well. But let's not forget that these 3 cities are perhaps some of the most expensive and competitive in terms of getting real estate in the world. We're talking Hong Kong, Vancouver, New York, London, Tokyo, Taipei is right up there. It's hard to find real estate, and it's expensive. But it's always been expensive, and one has to wonder if it's a function of. It is definitely a function of incomes not going as fast as real estate prices, but also the fact that demand has not let up. So people want to live in these big cities. That's where the jobs are, and that is part of this chicken and an egg question of what is that driving demand. What happens if a young person moves out of downtown Hong Kong Central and to the outskirts? Is it easier to find housing? Yes. Is it cheaper? A little bit, not a lot, not as much as it should be. Same thing with Vancouver. Same thing with Toronto or New York or Paris.
But even with that solution,
Paris is a bad example.
Even with that example, or basically moving out, moving further, you're always giving up something, be it convenience, be it a job perhaps that you want. And in the case of that discussion, one of them was talking about giving up, going for higher studies overseas to own a home. So Alan, I want to bring you in here and talk about the emotional impact there is of this desperation to own a home in the younger generation, have to choose certain things that may be important to them, but deciding that actually bricks and mortar are much more important.
I think in Taiwan, the youth, just like I say in previous time, I think we don't have a proper choice about house. I always have jokes to say that if you're in Taiwan, urban depends on luck. whether you are lucky or not, or your family, Just like we can see the video, the people say, oh, the reason why you could rent a house is because you are lucky, because you are lucky, or you have family. Yeah, and if you want to buy a house, I always say, oh, you must have a rich family, or you got a lottery.
You mentioned something about it is difficult to find an apartment that young people like, or they're not getting
I think in Taiwan, I think in Taiwan, our rental housing supply is not enough, or the quality is not so good in Taiwan. Yeah, because you can see the video, the good rental housing is hard to find. But in Taiwan, we have a lot of vacant house. Yeah, according to government's statistics, we have 10 to 20%. It's very, very high. So I think the housing condition is different from other countries. Of course, just like you say, that the housing is a good investment target in Taiwan. So lots of people, they will take their property. They are unwilling to rent it out. Yeah. So I think in Taiwan, our problem is not our stock. I think our housing stock is.
So you're saying in Taiwan, to Alfred's point here, the issue is not supply, but it's the quality of housing. Let's listen in. The government has decided that they are going to address this housing crisis, especially here in Taiwan, and especially for younger people. So they're looking into implementing a home buying scheme for young people. Our reporter, Stash Butler, takes a look at what that would look like, and I'd like your comment after that on whether this could address some of the problems.
Taiwan is facing a housing crisis. Compared to wages, prices here are some of the highest in the world, and the country's interior minister says that he is ready to act.
政府的一个政策的方向应该是要这个针对投机者来言语这个打击。
But just how hard is it to buy a house in Taiwan? Take a two-bedroom apartment of 70 square meters, for example. In Taipei, that would cost you about $500,000 but the average salary for all ages here is just $22,600. So you need to save for almost 6 years without spending a single penny just to afford the down payment.
永远都买不起啊，在台湾的，在台北的话，
大概40岁以后，
可能就是期许自己40岁了。
可是薪水都不涨，然后房价一直涨。
Fixing Taiwan's housing crisis is a long-term project, and the country's interior minister has less than a year before the next general election when he could lose his job. So he'll be hoping his new housing plan can put Taiwan on the right track and be the vote getter that keeps him in office. Damon Lin and Stash Butler in Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
So let me bring this to you, Alan. Is that the right way to go? Does it look like Taiwan's government is listening to what young people need?
To be honest, I think their policy didn't meet people, especially youth need, because what they do is to more subsidize, to more money, to give youth more money to buy. But I think the money is not a good way. You call subsidize. I think subsidize is not a good policy.
Well, one of the issues here I find in Taiwan is that while the government does try and give subsidies, you can deduct some of your rent from income tax. The problem is landlords often don't declare that they're landlords. And so you can't go through the proper system. Is that a problem you find, Alfred, in other parts of the world? It seems like the rules favor the landlords more than they favor the tenants?
In some places. Canada, for example, has taken significant steps to, one, protect tenants by limiting how much rents can be increased every year. You cannot move tenants out unless the landlord's moving back in or has to do significant renovations that make the property unlivable, things like that. They've also taken steps to put significant taxes on empty housing units, whether it's apartments or houses. So if I buy a house and I don't rent it out within a year, then I start paying more taxes. It's essentially places like British Columbia, where Vancouver is, they've made it illegal to hold empty units. On the other hand, I think it's easy to blame the landlords for these issues, but let's not forget that the older people today that have homes that have benefited from the rapid price increases over the last 15 years or so around the world are the young people of yesterday. They were the ones that took the that invested in those properties and are now have those that extra net worth. If you take that away, not only they, but also their children, who are the youth of today, would be out significant amounts of money. So I know many families in Vancouver who've seen their family homes go up in value enormously the last 10 years. They bought them for $500,000 15 years ago. They're now worth 2.5 million Canadian dollars. So they're millionaires on paper. And if you take those property values away, not only the parents, but also the children are no longer millionaires. They just lost out on 15 years of property rights, right? So there's that. Governments have to balance that out as well. Taking away money from the older people that are no longer working or maybe on fixed incomes and whatnot.
One of the solutions for governments in particular is social housing across the board. And according to governments, that is the way to tackle especially low demand or high demand, low supply. So we spoke to Taipei's Department of Urban Development to find out what they're doing.
The primary goal of the social housing project in Taipei is to provide enough apartments to meet the needs of citizens who cannot afford to rent at market prices. So far, we have provided 22,496 such apartments at 132 locations. We want to provide quality housing for citizens who have renting-related needs. For example, we have long-term care institutions and employment service centers. We also provide childcare services nearby for young parents and couples who need an infant daycare.
So Alan, it sounds like they're tackling some issues, they're really giving it some attention. Is it enough, and has this been effective?
I think this policy is still ongoing now, and I think the amount is not enough to meet people's need, because we in Taiwan, our social housing just built in this recently, and according to our central government say they will build 200,000 units. Yeah, in this year, in the end of this year, but it's just about 2% of the total housing stock. So I think it's not enough for Taiwanese people, especially the youth. Yeah, and I think public housing is not a total solution. Yeah, for example, we all know that Hong Kong has the almost highest public housing stock. But everyone knows that, right? The housing price is still top one. I always say Hong Kong is top one and Taipei is top two. So I think public housing is maybe partly a solution, but it's not a total solution.
Right, and it doesn't address one of the main issues that comes down to numbers. In that report that we watched from Stash, he talks about the income gap. Now, this is what it looks like in Taipei. Let's bring up that graph. In Taipei, the price-to-income ratio is currently above 16.
16
so what does that mean? That means that a person needs to save over 16 years' worth of salary, not spending a cent, to be able to afford an average house. Now, I want to take this to Alfred. What is the situation like in some of the other cities you're watching?
Hong Kong is I think Hong Kong has the highest number in the world. I didn't realize Taipei was so high, but I knew it was high. Vancouver is also high. So yes, and that's a tricky number though, that you need to save X number of years to afford the down payment. It has definitely gone up, but so have real estate prices over the last 15 years. The boom has been impressive, and it is getting harder and harder to buy a home. So this is why this program. I'm a big believer in the subsidy programs. I don't know about public housing. I think it's useful, and in Hong Kong in particular, it's about half the population live in public housing, as Alan, I'm sure you know that. So it has to be one prong of multi-prong approaches. I think public housing combined with subsidies, combined with financing, if the government steps in with financing guarantees to help younger people buy homes, that can go a long way towards getting them into the property ladder. Perhaps longer mortgages might be an idea. There's no need, even if somebody buys a home, there's no need to pay off the mortgage before selling that home, right? So being able to access a longer mortgage, say a 100-year mortgage, knowing full well that's never been paid, with a government backing might go a long way towards getting more people into a property ownership structure.
100-year mortgage, very interesting idea. I want to move us on to another phenomenon that's happening, and this particularly down under. There's a camp that blames the youth's habits of putting home ownership out of their reach. And in Australia in particular, there is a heated debate between the older generation and the younger one, which centers around avocados. Have a look at these tweets here. These ones hit back at that kind of a narrative. Just another day of being a millennial, used all the exposure I earned after 3 weeks of working to afford one avocado, which I will use as currency for my new flat, which is just a drawer in a morgue. Now, the next tweet, as millennial parents, we're starting our kid on avocado toast early so that he can't afford a home in 30 years. What is this all about? Well, we asked Nicole Johnston, a journalist living in Sydney, to explain.
Here in Sydney, you find that older generations are constantly criticising the younger generations, the millennials, for being unable to save a house. They're effectively blaming it on them. And one of the things that they say is that young people are spending too much money on their breakfast, on avocado on toast. It sounds ridiculous, but what they really mean is that unlike the older generations, they're not saving and sacrificing long enough and hard enough to buy a house or buy a property, and that's their own fault. Obviously, younger people don't agree with that at all. They say that it wouldn't matter how hard they saved, how many breakfasts, coffees, avocado on toast they gave up, that because of the crazy price of real estate here and the incomes that people earn, there is no way they could ever afford to buy.
So, Alan, are we hearing those kinds of allegations, accusations made at the young people saying, look, if you were more careful with your money, you could afford a home?
To be honest, I think in maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, Taiwan, most of Taiwanese people always think so. I think this discourse means that housing is private issue. It's not a public issue. It means, the reason why you couldn't buy a house is because you spend too much money on other place, or you didn't work hard enough, or something like that. But we think it's a policy problem, just like Alfred say, maybe a subsidy or public housing or a mortgage or a tax or something like that. So I think, in Taiwan, we always will discuss this issue. Some media will say, the reason why you couldn't buy a house is because you spend too much money in unimportant things, but nowadays more and more people awareness that's another reason. I think that's because real estate market problem. That's not a personal issue at all.
And Alfred, are you hearing this kind of narrative in other places?
Yes, and in many ways, I agree with it with a grain of salt. The grain of salt being that. Young people have always had a hard time saving enough money to buy their first home. If you are 22 years old, 30 years ago, you couldn't go to your first job and buy a house. Everybody had to save for a while for a down payment. It's getting harder, but it had to be done. The difference was that perhaps 20, 30 years ago, more people had, say, dual incomes. So you were living on one income and you could save that a lot faster. Whereas nowadays, it seems like younger people are thinking about doing it on their own, singly, and there's almost this feeling of, my parents have a house or an apartment, I should have a house or an apartment, and I'm almost entitled to get it really fast without the sacrifice that they put on. I see it with my children and nephews and whatnot. I'm of the older generation. I don't particularly like avocado toast, but I do think that there is a sense of housing is too expensive. There's no point in saving for it, so we will spend money on other things. And maybe it's not as hopeless as all that. And if I can take it a little bit further, I'm also not completely bought into this idea that one has to buy a house. The German market is a good example where renting throughout an entire life is perfectly acceptable, and home ownership is relegated to a small portion of the population.
So Alan, then I want to bring it back to that point there. Do you have to own a house? Is it really that important to own a house? Like Alfred said, can we just rent? Why not? You can find a place in an area you like. You don't have to sacrifice your future dreams, be it studying overseas or having a family. Why not rent?
As I know, some maybe European or some country, they have good regulation on rental markets. So I think so for them, house is a choice to buy or to rent, right? I think basically for a reasonable choice is good. We should not to. I think in Taiwan we don't have good regulations, so we force government to buy. We force people to buy. So if we want to have a good housing, what we could do is to buy. But I think that's because our regulation is not so good, and we don't have good policy to rent.
Buy or rent, when it comes to housing, there's so many conversations we can have around this topic. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Alfred Romann. And thank you, Alan Chan, for taking the time to be on the show today. And to our viewers, thank you for your company. It's been good to have you here with us. Please stay tuned for the next episode of Connected, and do stay connected with TaiwanPlus.